Okay, now that we've brought that foreground into Photoshop, what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate the layer, and I'm going to call that a foreground. Now that we've got that, we'll go over to the Move tool, grab that layer up to the other tab of the image that you already had open, and then drag it back down, and then line it up. Now with yours, you may not have the foreground perfectly aligned with your sky. So you'll probably have to play around with it to be able to get it to sit. So what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to mask that layer. So remember, we select the mask, we then get the paintbrush, and then we're going to paint away what we don't want. Making sure that, oops, let's try that again, 100 up there, press X to get rid of what we don't want. Now I'm going to zoom in so that we can do it with better detail. And then I'm going to get nice and picky in through all these small points. Now what I might do is I'll pause the video whilst I finish doing these edges, and then we'll come back. Okay, so I finished using the brush to get in nice and close on the edges here. Sometimes I find it actually easier to paint over these bits, and then because you've got those squares and those straight lines, or correction, rectangles and straight lines, then switch the brush over to white and input that information back in, then trying to paint it all out, and it winds up being a bit easier. So we can see what I've achieved here. I've put that foreground layer on, and it's sitting over the top. Now, like I was saying earlier, because your foregrounds may not exactly match the skyline, if we go over to the Move tool, what you have the ability to do with your images is to actually drag those up or left and right as you require to cover over what foreground you may already have in place. I'm just going to sit that back where it was. Okay, and then that way you can cover over any foreground that may be in the image, and then it allows you to separate the sky from that foreground. Now with this particular image, I don't like the balance that I've got with this framing, so I'm actually going to crop this. So I'm going to go across to the crop tool, and I want to balance the frame. I'm actually going to change that. I know earlier how I was saying we'll stick with the original ratio, and then we can drag that in, and then what I really want to try and achieve is have the steps running, or the railing, from the left corner and the right corner as well at the same time. Now that I've dragged that in, I don't know whether I'm really going to get that balance that I'm looking for with this image. I think it's going to be offset regardless, just purely from where I positioned it when I was taking the image, unfortunately. But the ideal image, you'd have that railing running right into that corner there, and then this railing running right into that corner there, so that you've got that symmetry in your image, and it'll look pretty good. So I might just have to try and align the symmetry up a little bit further on the stairs. So these posts here, that post there, that post there, and then this one running into the center. You can see where the center of the image is. That's probably going to be the best way to achieve the symmetry in this image. And then we've got the Milky Way running up to that right hand corner. So we've got leading lines, and leading up the stairwell, and then into the Milky Way. So I'll run with that one. Remember, we don't want to have delete. We don't want delete crop pixels, because that becomes destructive. And if I change my mind and I don't want to do that, crop, then it's going to disappear. Now the other thing that's probably a little bit distracting to my eye at the moment is this is not flat. So I'm going to use that straighten the horizon tool, or the straighten tool. So click on that one there, and then click, drag across that line. As we can see, it's minus 1.2, the angle, and then it's going to square up that image a bit better. And that's almost actually helped me out with that composition down the bottom left and bottom right as well. That's almost balanced that a little bit better as well. Oops, what did I do there? Alright, so hit enter on that one. Yeah, so that's squared that up. But now this one down the bottom's a little bit crooked as well. So I guess I might crop just a touch more. Actually, no, I'll adjust the frame a touch more, so I get rid of that distinct angle on that crooked stair down the bottom there. And that probably sits a bit better that way. Okay, and now if we bring up that crop tool, let's see, we've almost got that rule of thirds going as well. So that's sitting across the horizon there. We've got the bottom third filled with that information, and then we've got the point of high contrast sitting at the intersection of that top right corner there of the grid. So point of high contrast, leading lines running in to the center of the image, to the bottom of the Milky Way, then leading up to that point of high contrast, the point of interest in your image. Okay, so I'm happy with that crop at the moment. Now probably the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a bit of a high contrast curve just for the bottom, just to lift that up a little bit more. So if right now with that curve layer, that's going to affect the entire image. I don't want that. I want it to only affect the foreground. So what you do is we click on this box here, and as you can see there, it says this adjustment affects all layers below. So you click on that, and now what that does is just going to assign it to that foreground, not everything else. So if I click middle of that curve, and I drag that up, you can see it's making the adjustment to the foreground alone, and it's not doing anything to the sky, so it's not adjusting that. So I'm just going to add a bit of contrast, drag it up. I think that looks it's probably, I might brush away a little bit across the top here just to fade it off, because it's a bit too much of contrast at the edge between the sky and the foreground there. So I've got the mask layer there selected. I'll drag my opacity down on a brush to about 10, and I'm going to remove some of that effect just to soften that edge between the sky and the foreground. So it doesn't look quite as harsh. Right. And that, I think is